Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to the final podcast and also the final episode of Conversations with my wife for current affair for the year 2020. Now, together with the end of 2019, it's probably fair to say that this particular year was an annus horribilis. There's been so much going on, issues about climate, the pandemic, political issues, economic issues, and the list keeps growing on and on and on. Now, one of the things that stands out for me is that probably the two major casualties of this year were people and the truth. So, Lorin, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I'm glad. You're not going to get away. It's the beauty of being married.
That's right.
Well, you could get away, but you know what I mean.
I do, darling, I do.
Okay, so just to get the ball rolling, would you agree with my observation that the major casualty this year has really been about people and the truth?
Well, I think that it's been such a complex year for so many people. And I think that there are different experiences all over the world. So the experience of us here in Australia is quite different to that in the UK, Europe and America. India, Brazil, some countries have just been completely sideswiped by this. They have not coped at all with this pandemic. The fact that we were already, I think, hunkered down into a community cooperative process because of the terrible fires that ravished our country from September 2019 through the whole summer and early spring period, I think was something that other countries didn't have already in place. In this country, whenever we have fires, we all come together. It is just part of our history and part of who we are. No matter where people are, whether they're at risk or not at risk of that particular fire, everyone pulls together. And we were in that place when the pandemic hit. So we just sort of kept pulling together.
It's almost like part of our DNA, isn't it? Except, the observation that I've made about that is that unfortunately the ruling politicians didn't seem to play ball quite as well. There's still, sectors of our rural community that have not seen any financial aid at all to get them back on their feet. It's been local communities that helped each other to recover. But certainly from a federal point of view, it's seriously questionable.
Yes, but then that's one of our strengths, that we do not rely on our politicians to fix problems for us.
That could be an answer.
Yes, there has been some failures and there's been some successes. Despite them, despite their ways of being as politicians, and their idea of themselves as a political class. And I think class and ideology around class has a significant part to play in why different countries dealt with this challenge of the pandemic in different ways. I think that it has been a fundamental process of actually using divisions within societies to widen those divisions and make people far less cooperative, far less of a community as a whole. And we've seen this happening.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because, you know, in my sort of rehabilitation from my shoulder surgery, I've been doing quite a lot of reading. Probably not the best with my eyes at the moment, but one of the people that I've been reading quite a bit on is E.O. Wilson, a biologist who has been dubbed probably Darwin's heir or the Darwin of the 21st century. Now, one of the quotes that I found that he made was that he sees that political ideology has corrupted the mind and science. Now, I thought that was quite an apt quote for the current situation. And your observation obviously leads me into bringing that up. So how do you read that quote?
Well, it's a simple quote, but if you tease it out by looking at more of his ideas and work, you can see where he's coming from in that that holding on to beliefs about ideology closes our mind instead of opening it up. It actually creates boundaries and borders around our thinking.
And therefore corrupts science.
Yes, because
an endeavour to find truth and wisdom.
Well, science is one way of looking for truth and wisdom. Science actually is a discipline that needs many other disciplines to support it. And one of the most important disciplines that needs to support science, or that scientists need to be open to being supported by, is a philosophical approach to their work.
Which is interesting because two of what are considered, our greatest thinkers at the present time, Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson, have basically rubbished philosophy. Stephen Hawking's made the observation that science is dead, and Neil deGrasse Tyson has basically suggested that philosophy is useless, which I find is really interesting because both of them are theoretical physicists. So a large percentage of their time is actually philosophising by definition. And the rest of it, in order to articulate this in a quantifiable way, whatever ideas that they come up with, is the methodology of science.
I think that both of those men have failed to grasp that there's more to philosophy than academic philosophy that is located within universities. They see a lot of the philosophical work that's done around them, because remember, they're located within academic institutions as well.
Absolutely.
As being irrelevant to their work because it is focused in a different perspective. However, any university that has a robust philosophy of science program would have philosophers who would be extremely useful for scientists, who would be able to collaborate and support scientific inquiry and provide an opportunity for scientists to clarify their thinking and to remind scientists that science does not stand alone. It is part of the human project, and it really does need to fit into the needs of the human rather than the needs of the scientist.
Well, it's interesting you should bring that up because one of my choices at university was I chose a university that allowed me to study psychology and philosophy in concurrent streams. And my reasoning for that was fundamentally philosophy teaches me how to think, and psychology will teach me what to think about within that body of knowledge and then bring the two together. So it's a synthesis of ideas, concepts and methods in understanding the whole field, that whole landscape of what I'm endeavouring to become part of. Now, one of the universities didn't see any point in that at all. In fact, two of the universities that I approached had that same attitude. The institution that I eventually ended up going to had absolutely no problem with the idea. They, in fact, embraced it. So instead of seeing faculties as exclusive territorial towers, they saw studying as an inclusive process that should draw from different fields. Right? So, in essence, what they were doing is they were going, we need to dismantle the ivory tower. Now, unfortunately, to some degree, that philosophy hasn't necessarily maintained itself throughout. I supervise psychologists, and there are two problems that I have with quite a number of them. One is that they're shy of reading. They read abstracts, and you'll be lucky to get them to read an article, but they do not delve into the history of psychology, nor have they had any education in philosophy at all. So their capacity to extrapolate and integrate information from other fields, in my view, is restricted. So part of my supervision process with them is to actually help them to expand that. And one of the things that I keep getting back from them is how, firstly, interesting it is, and secondly, how it's influencing their capacity to work as a therapist. So to hear people like Hawkins and Neil deGrasse Tyson and the political leaders, in essence, try to restrict the arts, the humanistic teachings to such a degree that it renders them useless. And because institutions like university these days are corporatised, they're not going to make any money on it, so we're going to have less of that. Do you think that's going to have a really detrimental impact to deal with crises such as we've seen over the past year and a half?
I think that it is a major problem, and it's been evolving for many decades now, and that is the narrowing of education to an instrumental process, one that is more vocational than educational. We used to have separate systems, and that worked well because those who were seeking a purely vocational training program could access that easily through a very robust TAFE system. And those who were seeking to follow a more academic and educational program could do so through universities. It fails to meet either needs well when you tailor your educational program to be narrow and exclusive rather than inclusive. And I think that this is a major problem in terms of teaching people how to think. And it starts in school. It is a major problem that we no longer teach people how to think, how to understand the information they're given and analyse it critically. They are therefore far more easily brainwashed and lied to, and they are far more easily accepting of false facts and non-truths. And what is it Trump calls it?
Fake news.
Fake news. Without a robust understanding of how we came to be where we are today as a human society and as different human societies on this planet, we are really unable to evaluate what is going on competently, and it affects all of our lives. Every single person has to make decisions about how they live their lives, and if they don't have the capacity to tease through all the information coming at them and find good quality information and understand what a fact is and what truth is as opposed to what ideology is, then they are not going to be able to make good decisions for themselves and their families. It goes down into that simple place of us making decisions that are good for our lives and our families' lives. And that is what philosophy is about. The main question of philosophy is what makes a life good, what makes it good to live in our lives, how to live our lives in a way that we flourish and, blossom and have good experiences. And, this is a conversation that we've been having in the Western world. Western philosophy is a conversation that's been going on for 3,000 odd years. And as all conversations, it is something that needs to have input from different places. One person having the conversation is not a conversation at all.
No, obviously not.
So the idea that there is one thought that is right is obviously going to lead us astray in the end.
Well,
and that's what ideology is.
Yeah, and that's what ultimately ends up with a dictatorship, a tyranny.
That's right.
The Greeks were very well aware of this, and, the Persians were able to put it into practice in an absolutely succinct way. And so have religions. The idea of the Pope, whose infallibility is held, in high esteem. Now, those sorts of ideas were not necessarily questioned until the Enlightenment. So here's the point, though, okay? So we can get into the lofty sort of philosophical, sociological, anthropological debates, but the question is this technically really, truly relevant to the everyday person? To you and I, to our neighbours, to the kids? And if so, how? Especially when we've got a crisis like the pandemic. In the pandemic, there's been this enormous focus on economy. And, the economy was almost anthropomorphized, it was made into this almost human-like thing that needed to be protected above all else. In fact, people were known publicly to say, well, if we're going to lose a couple of thousand people but it saves the economy, I'm good with that.
Yes, people did say that. There were several quite well-known journalists and economists and people who belong to those think tanks who came out saying that it was an acceptable sacrifice of we don't know how many thousand people really. I mean, if you look at the American experience of losing thousands and thousands a day,
it's close to
is that an acceptable sacrifice to all of those families who have lost members that they loved and cared for, so that the economy could continue? And what is the economy other than a tool that humans use to trade goods and services? And as humans, using our tools, we decide how to use them and when we use them.
Well,
and, if you think about the economy as something that lives by itself, as an entity that exists irrespective of us. Outside of context, then, you may come to the conclusion that somehow it's important on that level. But it's only important in the sense that we ensure that the common wealth of the country is reasonably fairly distributed, that no one is left behind to starve while someone else has far more than they could ever need. And I think that this pandemic has opened up an opportunity for us to discuss how we've come to think of the economy as something that is existent on its own, with its own power and its own drive outside of human context. I think that a lot of people who have suffered terribly in terms of loss of business, loss of income, having to find new accommodation, losing their homes, all over the world, this has been happening to people because the economy has been interrupted by the pandemic and the needs of public health to dominate for this period of time. And this is an opportunity for us to reevaluate what we value. And that is a philosophical question.
Yeah.
What is valuable? What is more valuable? Some sort of process by which goods and services are traded that enables some people to make lots of money and other people very little, or the common good of people, their lives, their health, their well-being. Which is more important?
Well, it's interesting because, the billionaires during this pandemic have actually gotten wealthier and wealthier and wealthier.
Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're not exactly vested into finding a solution to this dilemma, or being able to be part of the conversation about how do we look at this system of economics and human beings together. And without people, there's no economy.
Well, that's right.
Kiss it goodbye. This is not, the whole nonsense of, people talking about the economy is just that. It's a nonsense. And, as long as we maintain that in that context, we are missing the point. The other point that comes up with that is the impact. As a psychologist, I've been part of a profession that sees, the so-called, psychological impacts of the pandemic and the natural disasters, and I'm not taking away from that. But you pointed out an interesting book, which I haven't read yet, but I'm really interested in reading, which is called Manufacturing Victims. And I think that we need to actually have a serious conversation on that level as well, in terms of the impacts of natural disasters, pandemics on the individual. Now, the temptation the fact of the matter is that within the process of psychiatric and psychological diagnosis, human reaction is immediately placed as a dispositional thing. It's contained in you. So if you, are in this context called a crisis and you get, either anxious or depressed, that's somehow a part of your, for want of a better word, nature, right? Now, the temptation is to keep it in that. Now, obviously, lots of people go, no, well, that's nonsense, because we were also talking about the situation contributes, or at least exacerbates, if not causes, that reaction, that psychological distress, right? The area where we don't have a lot of conversation about is when it's systemic. Like in the United States at the moment, Trump has literally dragged the chain of releasing funds for people. Now, my understanding is that he's decided to go along with it right now. It was the latest piece of news. But in that process, millions of people are literally hanging out completely at the mercy of a system. Physically, psychologically, socially. And the problem that I have with this whole system is that those people are not part of the conversation when they have a right to be. And that is what should be the process in a democracy.
I think that a lot of people have found themselves in very precarious positions after decades where democracy seemed to be working for the majority of people, where you have one of the most important aspects of a democracy, a robust and large middle class, people who are able to support themselves in a dignified and useful manner, who are able to be educated and have good health care and live lives that are comfortable, and where they have certain levels of agency and autonomy within their lives. That is the most important aspect of maintaining a democracy. And over the last 50 years, the middle class has been narrowed and has become smaller and smaller. The gig economy that we're all talking about here in Australia is the sort of, I think, the wedge that is being used to divide people.
Well, it's the marginalisation
of the worker back again. It's like sending us back to the feudal system.
Yeah, it's a
and in
form
many
of
ways,
wage slavery.
when you think of the gig economy and how it has shown itself to be not just dangerous to those people who are forced to be part of it, in terms of them not being able to have any sort of security in their work, but it's dangerous to the rest of us. If we look at the Victorian example of their spike in the pandemic, it was caused by workers who were unable to put food on the table unless they went to 3 or 4 different jobs, all casualised, all poorly paid, all marginalised. And so the pandemic just went like wildfire through this group of people and then out into the wider community. And so in the end, it's not just dangerous for those people who are caught up in that gig economy. It's dangerous for all of us because it wasn't only them who got the illness and died from it. It was a large range of other people who they are in contact with. And, you know, this is a perfect example of how mistreating parts of society is always going to create a problem for all of the society.
So how, if we then take it from the more lofty experience and critical thinking and go, okay, we need to have more people engaged in more meaningful conversations, right? Now, we're talking about actual philosophical issues. How can we effectively do that? Now, one of the thoughts that got to me the other day was some time ago. I can't remember his name now. I wrote a book on Socrates Cafe.
Yes.
And it was essentially, the idea was that a large part of therapy is actually about philosophical thinking, not about psychological treatment. And I would agree with that. With the men and boys that I see, there's a significant amount of my work with them that starts off as psychological treatment, i.e. how do I effectively deal with my anxiety and depression. But part of the evolution of that within the therapeutic relationship is also to help people get a different understanding, a different mental landscape about themselves and the environment and the system and the situations they're in, and how to deal with that more effectively. Now, to me, in a lot of instances, it's philosophical.
Yes, it is.
So, instead of locating something like a Socratic Cafe as a treatment or an intervention thing, wouldn't it be useful to have this community conversation of gatherings of people like the Greeks had? Except in this case, it's not just men who happen to be citizens of Athens or Thebes or whatever, but, men and women, citizens, non-citizens, to be able to discuss this and to actually plug into enhancing their own well-being, but also that of the community.
A Socratic Cafe, let's just break this down. Socrates was a philosopher in Athens, and his way of pursuing philosophy was to ask questions. In fact, apparently, he was very, very irritating at times because he would stop people in the street of Athens and ask them significantly important questions about life,
Yep.
about what was good about life, what they thought about particular things that were going on at the time, what their ideas were. And he was someone who believed that you needed to question everything. And a Socratic cafe is just a title for getting together. Now, yes, it could be actually in a cafe, and that's what that particular author was writing about. He was writing about his own experience where he had started taking philosophy out of the university and into cafes. He'd also gone everywhere else, actually, but it was the idea that you sit down in a cafe with some coffee and you sit around and you talk. Now, this is not a new idea. The intellectuals of the 18th and 19th century sat around in cafes and talked, and they did a lot of their philosophical work in that process, but they didn't include the non-philosophers and the non-scholars. And so they just basically moved the university to a cafe and had good coffee while they talked.
And smoked rich
cigars. cigars. But
Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung,
Christopher
Marx.
Phillips, who was the man who wrote a book called Socrates Cafe, was talking about people coming together in all sorts of places. It could be around the dining room table, it could be in a schoolyard, it could be down the beach, it could be in a cafe, it could be anywhere, in a church, a community hall, people coming together to talk about life and to talk about the important aspects of life as humans living together and how to make that work so that the majority of us have a good life and have an opportunity for a good life. Unfortunately, the current approach to ideas of the good life have been commercialised and objectified and quantified and are all around materialistic stuff.
Instagram,
and
TikTok.
And the understanding that a good life is about how you think and feel and not about what you own has been lost. So having philosophical discussions is not about what colour your shoes are. It is about how you think about yourself and others in the world and how we can all have a better life together. And so those clients of yours and every other psychological practice and all those people who may be finding this pandemic really hard to deal with, what would be useful for them is to be able to contextualise this, to be able to go, yes, we're having a hard time, but we've done this before. Our ancestors have done this, and our children will do this, and we can manage this if we approach it in the right way. And the right way to approach it is to come together as a community and look after each other and do our best to help each other to get through it.
So these are the lessons of the pandemic, essentially, if we really want to nail it down. I mean, they're lessons throughout history.
That's right.
But the problem is people's perception of history is one, two-dimensional and often non-existent.
Well, you know, I've always believed that history should be a mandatory subject in schools. And not soundbite history, but the sort of big history that, gives you a real understanding of how humans have come from where we began to where we are now and the mistakes that we made and how we really don't want to make those again. And I think one of the most important things that we could remember is that, we have been here before, and this is in fact, the pandemic of 2020 is in fact a small hiccup compared to what humans have had to deal with in the past.
Oh, absolutely. But, people are struggling.
People are struggling, and I think one of the reasons they're struggling is because they're not able to put it into that bigger picture. They're not able to, they don't remember that my own grandparents, so younger people's great-grandparents, who were born at the beginning of the 20th century, would have been confronted by First World War, then the Spanish flu, then a Great Depression, and then the Second World War before they're 50. You know, they would have had all of that in their first 50 years of their lives. And, you know, they all managed it. And what did they do? They came together and they worked together as a community. And democracy flourished post-Second World War for 30 to 40 years until it started being undermined by a new economic theory that started to divide people up and use them as resources. And I think that, you know, we need to maybe step back and start to rethink our current direction.
Well, this is where I talk about the humanisation. You know, you use the word, you know, relationships are transactional and instrumental these days. And, you know, if it's not working for you, you know, get out of it. Rather than going, hang on a minute, what's the deeper meaning in that connection? And the struggle for a lot of people is this sense of disconnection, which is interesting given what our response to the pandemic has been, which is that we needed to isolate, we needed to have social distance, we needed to lock down all the things. But in many respects, we have a technology available to us that still keeps us connected to some degree, but it hasn't been enough for some reason. Now, my argument is that it hasn't been enough because we haven't had that fundamental underlying connection that many of our previous generations have had because the technology hadn't interfered with it. I mean, you know, being on Instagram, Facebook, whatever social media is not an intimate relationship. It's not an intimate connection, which fundamentally brings us into that realm where, you know, if connections gives us resilience, right? There's some other issues that gives us resilience, but if that social connection is one of the things that gives us resilience, communally, socially, culturally, we have seriously failed in that project. My sense is that a huge part of it, and it comes with the dismantling of the middle class, is that, you know, we have created greater and greater and greater divides, which have been fed by political ideologies.
I think one of the major problems we have is that we have shifted our values from connection to other people to a very materialistic and objectifying process, and connection to things, connection to ideas that are very simplistic and very narrow and have very little fundamental substance to them. And people have become very gradually, I think, used to this idea that being friends or being emotionally connected with another person is based on very superficial connections, like we belong to the same club, or we agree, we like the same music, or we sort of went to school together. And there's been no drilling down in those relationships to fundamental ideas of connection about whether we actually agree with each other about really important things, like what we believe is good for us to pursue in our lives, why we think that we'd like to stay connected in terms of the next 40 or 50 years as friends, rather than just, we like to go out and party together.
Well, the problem there is that, the focus has been on individualism. Okay, so, in the self-help book arena, it's all about me, right? How can I be more happy? What can I get? If you look at the sort of success literature, it's all about how I can, meet my ambitions. And most of it's competitive. It actually is not collaborative. It takes a lot for people to accept that when I become successful, I have done so together with others who have helped me. Yes, we get the, Bill Gates's, Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos doesn't really acknowledge that he's a billionaire times 10 because of the work other people have done. It's all him. Now, Bill Gates is a little bit different.
Oh, but that's a major problem all along. The businessman who doesn't want to pay his workers an appropriate wage because it's his business, without recognising that he doesn't have a business without people working for him, without people providing those goods or services that he's trying to trade. No one is successful at anything without other people being there to support them, to be part of that process. And it takes all of us to work together to have any success at anything. But yes, this push for individualism, and this is of course what we've seen in that every man for himself attitude that we have seen in the United States and in the UK, which has caused them to have such a horrific time through this pandemic, where they have had so many tens and hundreds of thousands of people getting sick and so many people dying. And while the rest of the country refuses to take simple steps to protect themselves and others from this illness, simply based on this individualistic idea of their rights existing somehow in the ether, completely failing to comprehend that rights are things that we give each other in order to make our societies work.
And together with the responsibility that arises
and
from
they come
them.
with obligations.
Yeah.
All rights come with obligations. And that they are something that we provide to each other and that are negotiable depending on the situation, which is why, we have allowed ourselves to make some changes in the way we function in this country because of the obligations we have to each other that do trump, and I don't really want to use that word the way I have, but it is, some rights trump other rights. It's as simple as that. They are more important than other rights.
Yep.
And the right to life and for people to be kept safe is far more important than my right to go and buy a pair of shoes at a shop down the road in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah. Okay, we're coming towards the end of this podcast. So, covered a lot of ground, as we always do. 3 takeouts for what we learned from the pandemic. What can we take out of this crisis that helps us to be better than what we've been?
I think one of the most important things is that we each have a responsibility as members of a community to care about what happens to the other members of our community.
So compassion.
I think, secondly, that our best interests are served as individuals by the community as a whole.
To cooperation.
Cooperating with each other. This is how humans have flourished as a species. It is not just our opposable thumbs, it is the fact that we cooperate with each other. And thirdly, I think that we have been given an opportunity to look at what's happened in the last 12 months and how it has disturbed the automatic progression of life day to day, and use this as an opportunity to not only rethink how we want to live our own lives, but to perhaps make some demands of the people who have put themselves up to be our leaders, that they start to think a little bit more inclusively of the whole of the community and not just the very small number who seem to have all the power at the moment.
Lorin, as always, really interesting discussion. We could carry this on for hours and hours and hours. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful, and we'll see you on the other side in 2021 and see what we can do differently. Until next time, signing off. Now, just as a PS, those of you who've been paying particularly close attention, you would have picked up a little error when I said that Stephen Hawking said that science was dead. Now, obviously, in the context, what I meant to say was that philosophy is dead. Okay, again, signing off, my error. If you picked it up, great. If not, just go with the flow. Till next time, bye.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.